In 1961, a New York stockbroker, Ms. Genevieve Aubert to be precise, visited an exhibition by the French artist Henri Matisse at the Museum of Modern Art. 116,000 people saw the show over 47 days, including the artist's son Pierre. She was the only person to notice that the artist's work, Lovato, had been installed upside down. So she approached a museum guard. He reportedly told her, "You don't know what's up, and you don't know what's down, and neither do we." Apparently, this is still true, because if you do an internet search for Lovato these days, you can still find images of it reproduced upside down, at least in the eyes of Henri Matisse and Genevieve Aubert. I've always loved museums and galleries. As a child, I remember standing in line in New Orleans to see the treasures of Tutankhamun. I love how museums and galleries tell stories. In elementary school, we had a series of books called programmed readers. I don't remember if you've ever used them. They had a clear plastic overlay and a cardboard slider covered up the responses. You used a grease pencil to fill in your answers. It's what we call self-directed learning today. There were 21 books in the series, and the 20th dealt with Greek mythology. I don't know if you can even still teach Greek mythology in elementary school today. But I remember Minerva springing forth from Zeus's head, and the three fates passing around a single eye, and Prometheus chained to a rock, getting his liver pecked out every single day, which is particularly gross if you stop to think about it, and also an amazing story to tell a young boy in elementary school. I remember when I went to museums and galleries, these stories would spring to life. There, painted on the sides of Grecian pottery, you might see Daphne on the hunt, or Mercury flying on a pair of winged shoes. This might even be why I became a curator. So you can imagine my surprise years later, standing in a gallery in Sydney, Australia. It was a renovated warehouse space on Sydney Harbour. I was an intern working on my first show, and the show involved anyone who lived in the South Sydney City Council area. They'd been invited to submit up to 3 works, and then a jury of their distinguished peers would make a selection. But after all the works arrived, something unusual happened. The jurors decided to keep it all. They sorted out the works by established artists, and they put them in the gallery's 2 largest spaces, in what we'd call a standard linear hang. That means putting one work next to another. And they took everything else, and we're talking hundreds of works, and they stacked them floor to ceiling and wall to wall in the gallery's smallest space. It reminded me of when I was a teenager and I said to my parents, "Hey, can I put a few posters up in my room?" And then after you couldn't tell what color the walls was painted, I said, "Is this too much?" So there's actually a name for this type of hanging. We call this Salon style hanging. And in museums and galleries, this has actually been a way we've hung art for centuries. But we didn't traditionally see this in a contemporary space. Being a young intern, I was appalled. So I said to the gallery administrator, "How can we do this?" And he said to me, "We do it this way because we can." Now, because we can is actually a motivation for much of what we do in life. And when you think about it, because we can actually isn't the world's worst motivation. But because we can actually lacks a particular obligation. If you've ever trained adults, you know there's a maxim for helping them learn. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. Now, the problem with because we can in this particular instance was that nobody told anybody anything. First, nobody told the artists. Then, nobody told the audience. So if you came to the show and saw the works installed in 2 different ways, you might think that someone made a mistake. At the very least, it would be confusing. Now, curators already exist in an unusual world where people often say, "Well, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like." Let me share something with you. Often, knowing what you like is very much the same thing as knowing a lot about art. The museum director, David Ross, formerly of the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, once said, "Museums have a social purpose. You use your museum for the social purpose you like, because if you don't, someone else will." Now, I've often thought that the museums and galleries that I've worked in have two social purposes. One is to engage the audience, and two is to tell a story through art. Usually we focus very much on the former, and sometimes we focus very little on the latter. That's not to say that museums and galleries don't tell the truth in the stories they tell or they fabricate information. It's just to suggest that sometimes when you see a work of art, you may not get the whole story, and that's a problem. So professional curating actually is something more than selecting a list of your favorite songs or picking 10 pairs of your favorite socks. Professional curating actually comes from a Latin word, curare. It means to care for or to keep. Curators used to be called keepers because they would often look after objects that almost no one would ever see, held in places that almost no one could ever go. Now, curators are just as responsible for helping artists interpret their works in public forums as they are for making sure that the works in their care are safe. So when you view an object, there's some obligation for the story being told to be the one the artist wrote. Think about it this way. You go to an exhibition and you see 4 photographs and you love them all. What you don't know is that when the curator went to the artist's studio, they actually had 10 works to choose from, and the artist wanted to exhibit all 10. But the curator had limited space, or they had a particular theme. So they made the artist an offer. They said, show these 4 works, or don't show any at all. It's the curatorial equivalent of an offer you can't refuse. Now let's get something straight. In jazz, it's the notes you leave out that make the music. But in art, it's not the works you leave out that make the show. So when you see the exhibition as a visitor or a viewer, you may not know, in fact, you probably don't, that these 4 works are drawn from a larger group of 10. Does it matter? Well, let's say now it's 10 years later, and that artist is famous. And now, because you didn't when you had the chance, you've decided you might want to buy some of their work. And some is for sale. And you see that it's listed as being one of 10 works from the artist's earliest show. But you went to that show, and you remember it clearly. And wait a minute, there were only 4 works. What happened? Well, what the curator did was intervene. They inserted themselves between the artist and the audience, and they didn't tell the audience what they were doing. And in doing so, they left the audience to ask a question. The audience experienced the work, but they didn't have the whole story. So they were left to simply ask, with all this time and the artist could only make 4 works? So when you encounter a work of art, what you'll find is that oftentimes curators may have influenced the work in some way. It's your responsibility as a viewer to ask a question. Is what I'm seeing exactly like, somewhat similar to, or nothing like what the curator intended? Now, the challenge with this is that, in fact, curators have been intervening in how we experience art for decades. It's just how things are done, because we can't necessarily give you every bit of information about every work of art. But the flip side of this is, when you go to a gallery, you go in good faith. And the only person who can often mediate what it is that you experience is a curator. And they alter that experience for you for better, or sometimes for worse. So if you're in a gallery and you see a work and it's upside down, you have a right to know. Now, if I, as a curator, choose to hang it upside down, I should probably tell you. If you see a work that's hung upside down and you think maybe I don't know, like Geneviève Albert, I would appreciate it if you would tell me. Because if I choose to hang a work upside down, it should be because there's a reason, and not just because I can. Now, there's actually a bigger question that I suppose I should address, and that's this. As far as knowing which way is up and which way is down, I'm fairly certain that I don't know, and I can't say that you do either. But for now, let's all agree that we all do. Thank you.